On the morning of May 8, 1902, at 7:52, Mount Pelée erupted and Saint-Pierre, Martinique, ceased to exist. 30,000 people died in approximately 2 minutes. The eruption did not send lava into the city. It sent something that the volcanology of the era had not fully described and did not have a standardized name for. A superheated mixture of gas, ash, and rock fragments that traveled down the mountain at a speed of several hundred kilometers per hour and at a temperature of several hundred degrees Celsius. It moved faster than any person could run. It moved faster than any horse could carry a rider. It moved faster, in the seconds it took to reach the city, than any warning could have spread through a population of 30,000 people, even if a warning had been sounded. It killed almost everyone in Saint-Pierre so quickly that the city's population had no time to experience what was happening to them in any sequence that would have allowed for an organized response. Almost everyone. Not everyone. The man who survived in Saint-Pierre itself was in a prison cell. His name was Louis-Auguste Pelée. He had been imprisoned for a fight, and he was being held in a cell that was partially underground, with thick stone walls and a narrow ventilation slot near the top that faced away from the direction the eruption came from. The cell that had been built to confine him turned out to be, by accident of geometry and construction, approximately the most survivable structure in Saint-Pierre. He was severely burned. He survived. The eruption of May 8, 1902 was not the first sign that Pelée was becoming dangerous. It was not the second sign. It was not the 10th. The mountain had been showing signs of renewed activity since early April, and those signs had been reported, observed, discussed, and ultimately set aside by the officials responsible for deciding what to do about them. The decision-making process that ended at 7:52 on May 8th is documented in the telegrams, newspapers, and official correspondence of the preceding weeks. It is a documentation of how a government weighs the cost of precaution against the cost of delay and gets the calculation wrong in a way that kills 30,000 people. The island of Martinique in 1902 was a French colony in the Eastern Caribbean. Saint-Pierre was its largest and most economically important city, a port of considerable regional significance where rum, sugar, and tropical goods from the island's plantations moved onto ships bound for France and other markets. The city had approximately 30,000 inhabitants and a physical fabric of commercial buildings, churches, residences, and warehouses that reflected its standing as the commercial capital of Martinique. Saint-Pierre was known in the region as the Paris of the Caribbean. The description was not ironic. The city had a theater that hosted productions brought from France. It had a cathedral, a botanical garden, a hospital, schools run by religious orders, a cable connection to the Atlantic Telegraph Network, and a commercial district where merchants from France, from neighboring islands, and from further afield conducted business. The harbor was one of the busiest in the Eastern Caribbean, with ships from France, Britain, the United States, and Canada calling regularly. The streets of Saint-Pierre had electricity. The population included French colonial administrators, Creole planters of the established families that had defined the island's social hierarchy since the 17th century, free black and mixed-race merchants and professionals who occupied the middle levels of a social structure still shaped by the legacy of slavery abolished in 1848, and a working-class population of black laborers who constituted the large majority of the city's inhabitants. It was a city with all the contradictions of late colonial Caribbean society, operating at a level of material development that made it genuinely significant by the standards of the region. The volcano that overlooked it, Mount Pelée, rose to approximately 1,400 meters at the island's northern end and had last erupted in 1851, 50 years before, in an eruption that had been relatively modest and had caused no significant casualties. The memory of that eruption was present in the island's collective consciousness, but was not present as a warning. The last eruption had not been dangerous to the city, and the mountain had been quiet for half a century. In early April of 1902, the mountain began producing steam and ash from its summit vents. The emissions were visible from Saint-Pierre and were noted by the population with a mixture of concern and curiosity that a volcano's reawakening naturally produces. The colonial administration, led by Governor Louis Moutet, received reports from observers near the summit, and commissioned a scientific evaluation of the mountain's condition from the director of the local meteorological observatory, Gaston Land. Land visited the summit area and submitted his assessment. His report noted that the activity was consistent with what he described as the standard behavior of a reawakening volcano entering a phase of hydrothermal activity. He did not recommend evacuation. He recommended monitoring. His assessment was the product of the scientific understanding of volcanic behavior available in 1902, which was a scientific understanding that had not yet formally described the type of eruption that Pelée was building toward. The activity on the mountain intensified through April. Ash falls on Saint-Pierre became a regular occurrence. A sulfurous smell accompanied the ash. On April 23rd, the ash fall was heavy enough to darken the sky over the northern part of the island for several hours. The ash that accumulated on the streets and rooftops of Saint-Pierre was measured in centimeters. It clogged the drains. It killed the plants in the city's gardens. The horses and mules that worked the streets of the commercial district became agitated and difficult to control. Snakes. The fer-de-lance vipers that lived in the forested lower slopes of the mountain began moving in large numbers into the farmland and village areas at the base of the mountain. Several people and a significant number of livestock were killed by snake bites in the last days of April and the first days of May as the displaced snake population moved through inhabited areas. The snake deaths were reported in the press and discussed publicly as one of the more visible and alarming signs of the mountain's disruption of the surrounding ecosystem. The animals on the farms north of the city, in the zone between the city and the mountain, began showing signs of distress. On May 5th, 3 days before the main eruption, a lahar, a volcanic mudflow, came down from the mountain carrying debris and killing dozens of people in the sugar mill districts to the north and south of the city. The lahar was a significant event. It killed people. It destroyed property. It was visible evidence that the mountain was producing material capable of causing harm at distances from the summit that included the populated areas below. The lahar of May 5th did not produce an evacuation order. It produced a scientific commission. The governor appointed a committee of 5 members, including Landis, to visit the mountain and assess the situation. The committee departed on May 7th, 1 day before the eruption. The committee's report, which would have been submitted the following day, was never written. In the 3 days between the lahar and the main event, Saint-Pierre was a city living in an unusual state of suspended decision. People who had the means to leave had been leaving steadily since the mountain's activity had become serious in late April. The road south from Saint-Pierre toward Fort-de-France had been busy with people and carts for days. At the same time, Saint-Pierre had been receiving refugees from the villages further north, people who had fled the lahar and the snake migrations and the heaviest ash falls, and had moved toward what they hoped was the relative safety of a larger, more established settlement. The net effect was that Saint-Pierre in the first days of May was probably more populous than its normal 30,000, containing both its permanent residents and a substantial number of displaced people from the surrounding countryside who had no place to go that was further from the mountain. The shops of the commercial district were open, the cathedral was holding services, the telegraph office was operating, sending and receiving messages about the situation to Fort-de-France and to the French mainland. The cable to the Atlantic network that linked Martinique to the wider world was transmitting accounts of the mountain's behavior to newspapers in France and the Americas that covered the developing story with a mixture of scientific interest and dramatic titillation that a reawakening volcano in an exotic colonial setting naturally produced for metropolitan readers. On the morning of May 8th, the committee that had been appointed to evaluate the situation was on its way to the mountain. The newspaper carrying the governor's reassurance was available on the city's streets. The harbor held 17 ships, loading and unloading cargo in the ordinary course of the port's business. The market was open. The theater had a performance scheduled. The city was doing what cities do when they have been told by the people responsible for making such determinations that what is happening to them is not yet an emergency. At 7:52, the mountain decided otherwise. The governor had an additional concern during the weeks when the mountain was escalating its activity, and that concern was an election. The legislative elections for Martinique's seat in the French National Assembly were scheduled for May 11, 1902. The election in Martinique in the spring of that year was contested with unusual intensity because it involved a conflict between the established political interests of the island's white Creole planter class and the emerging political representation of the island's black majority population. The candidate associated with the white planter establishment was Louis Landes, a separate individual from the volcanologist of the same surname, and he was facing a strong challenge from a candidate supported by the black population of the island. The political geography of Martinique at that moment was such that the outcome of the election depended heavily on the votes of the population of Saint-Pierre and its surrounding districts. Governor Moutet was aligned with the Paris government and with the political interests of the established Creole planter class. His concern about the election was not merely administrative. An evacuation of Saint-Pierre and the northern districts of the island before May 11th would have removed the voters of those districts from the island's political geography at exactly the moment when their votes were needed. An evacuated district is not a district that votes. The people who had fled north from the mountain zone might not return in time to vote. The disruption that a formal evacuation order would create would benefit the political opposition. Whether the governor's decision not to evacuate Saint-Pierre was primarily determined by this electoral calculation, or whether he genuinely believed the scientific assessments that said the danger was not immediate, or whether both factors operated simultaneously, is a question the documents of the period do not resolve with the clarity that would allow a confident answer. What the documents show is the outcome. No evacuation order was issued. The governor published, in the official colonial newspaper, Les Colonies, a statement assuring the population that there was no immediate danger. And on May 7th, the day before the eruption, Moutet and his wife traveled to Saint-Pierre from the administrative capital of Fort-de-France to demonstrate, by their presence, that the situation was safe. The newspaper statement deserves specific attention because it is the document that most directly positioned the colonial population between evacuation and staying. The statement appeared on May 7th, the day before the eruption, under Moutet's authority, and described the activity of the mountain as consistent with normal volcanic behavior. It cited the opinion of the Scientific Commission. It explicitly addressed the fear of the population and characterized that fear as understandable but excessive. It told the people of Saint-Pierre, in the language of official reassurance, that the scientific experts were monitoring the situation and that the situation did not warrant the disruption of normal life. The statement was read by people who were already frightened, who had been watching ash fall on their city for weeks, who had seen snakes in the streets and heard about the lahar deaths north of the city, and who were trying to decide whether to stay or leave. For some of them, the official statement settled the question. The telegraphic correspondence between Moutet's office in Fort-de-France and the government in Paris in the weeks before May 8th shows that the governor was reporting the situation as manageable and that Paris was not pressing for stronger action. Whether Paris had access to information that would have led to a different response, whether there were communications that did not reach the historical record, and whether the colonial metropolitan relationship in 1902 France provided any mechanism for the national government to override a governor's assessment of a local emergency, are questions that the available documentation raises without fully resolving. Governor Moutet and his wife were in Saint-Pierre on the morning of May 8th. They died with the rest of the city. The eruption itself took approximately 90 seconds from the moment the mountain opened to the moment the main pyroclastic flow reached the city's edge. The survivors in the outer zones of the flow's reach, people who were on ships in the harbor or at the edges of the city's destruction zone, described seeing the mountain open and produce what appeared to be a black cloud that descended the northern flank of the mountain with extraordinary speed and entered the city from the north. The visual record from ships in the harbor, including testimony from the captain and crew of several vessels that were close enough to observe the event but far enough to survive with severe damage, consistently describes the cloud as moving faster than anything they had seen before and as arriving at the city before any sound associated with it. The pyroclastic flow, a term that was not in common use in 1902, but that describes accurately what Pelée produced, is a dense mixture of volcanic gas and fragmented volcanic material that flows along the ground surface under the force of gravity and its own momentum. It is not a cloud in the meteorological sense. It is not a lava flow in the geological sense. It is a third category of volcanic output that kills through a combination of extreme heat, physical impact from the moving material, and toxic gas. The temperature at the center of the flow that entered Saint-Pierre was several hundred degrees Celsius. The structures of the city, the buildings, the ships in the harbor, the infrastructure, were damaged by heat and impact simultaneously. The people in the city were killed, in the medical sense, by heat and by the sudden forceful intake of superheated toxic gas into the lungs. The city did not burn in the ordinary sense of fire spreading from one structure to another over time. It was simultaneously subjected to conditions that set flammable materials alight across the entire area the flow covered. The ships in the harbor, 17 at anchor or moored at the time of the eruption, were found afterward burned, dismasted, or sunk. One ship, the Roraima, a Canadian steamship that was arriving in port when the eruption occurred, survived in a badly damaged state because its position at the edge of the harbor gave it slightly more distance from the flow's center. The Roraima's crew and passengers included some who survived and who provided some of the most detailed eyewitness accounts of the event from the sea perspective. The rescue effort that reached Saint-Pierre in the hours and days following May 8th found a city in which the surviving population was, as far as the initial searchers could determine, essentially zero. The streets were covered in ash and debris to depths that made navigation difficult. The buildings were ruined. The bodies of the dead were in the positions they had been in when the flow arrived, burned and in some cases carbonized by the temperatures, in houses and in streets and in the locations throughout the city where 30,000 people had been living their lives at 7:52 on a Thursday morning. Louis-Auguste Siparis was found in his cell several days after the event, severely burned but alive, by rescuers who heard him calling. The stone cell had contained enough air for him to survive the initial flow and had been insulated enough from the heat to keep the interior temperature below lethal levels, though well above comfortable levels. The burns he suffered were serious and covered much of his body. He had been in the cell without food or water from the morning of May 8th until the rescuers reached him, surviving in the dark, in the heat, in the ruins of a city that had been his neighborhood before it became his tomb. He was removed from the cell, treated for his burns, eventually pardoned by the colonial administration because the crime for which he had been imprisoned seemed a trivial matter in the context of what had happened to Saint-Pierre, and released. He went on to work for a period as an exhibit in Barnum and Bailey's Circus in the United States, where he was presented as the sole survivor of the eruption of Mount Pelée. This description was not entirely accurate. Several hundred people had survived in the outer areas of the destruction zone and on ships in the harbor, but it reflected the sense in which Siparis's survival in Saint-Pierre itself was categorically different from the survival of people who had been at the margins of the flow's reach. He was the person who had been where everyone else was when the mountain struck, and he had lived. The cell that had held him prisoner had done so with walls thick enough and a ventilation slot positioned correctly enough to keep him alive through something that killed 30,000 people in 2 minutes. The rescue effort that reached Saint-Pierre in the hours and days following May 8th found a city in which the surviving population was, as far as the initial searchers could determine, essentially zero in the most affected areas. The streets were covered in ash and debris to depths that made navigation difficult. The buildings were ruined, not collapsed in the way that earthquake damage collapses buildings, but burned and in some cases structurally transformed by the heat of the flow. The bodies of the dead were in the positions they had been in when the flow arrived, in houses and in streets, and in the locations throughout the city where 30,000 people had been living at 7:52 on a Thursday morning. The rescue teams that worked through the ruins in the days following May 8th were working in conditions of continued volcanic activity. The mountain had not finished, and in heat from residual burning that made the work physically punishing. The ships that had been in the harbor and that had survived in various states of damage were among the primary sources of survivors and of testimony about what had happened. The Roraima, arriving in port when the eruption occurred, had passengers and crew who had been on deck when the flow arrived and who had survived at the edges of the thermal damage zone. Their accounts, given to journalists and official investigators in the days following, described the visual character of what they had seen. The mountain opening, the black cloud descending, the speed, the arrival in the city before any sound, the immediate transformation of the harbor from a working port to a field of burning and sinking ships. The question of what the colonial administration had known and when it had known it was the subject of official inquiry in the months and years following May 8th. The inquiry was a French government process, since Martinique was a French territory, and its scope included the actions of Governor Moutet, the scientific advice he had received, and the decisions he had made about evacuation in the weeks before May 8th. The inquiry found that the scientific advice available in April and early May of 1902 had been genuinely uncertain about the level of danger. The volcanology of the period did not have the descriptive framework that would have allowed a trained observer to identify what Pelée was building toward. The type of eruption that killed Saint-Pierre, what later volcanologists would call a nuée ardente, or glowing cloud, the type of eruption that 20th century volcanology would eventually categorize as a Pelean eruption, named for this event, was not one that the scientific literature of the era had characterized in terms that would have led an informed observer to predict it with confidence. Landis's assessment that the danger was not immediate was not, given the knowledge available in April of 1902, obviously wrong as a scientific judgment. This was the scientific contribution of the catastrophe. The eruption that killed Saint-Pierre gave volcanology the thing that catastrophes often give science, which is a documented example of a phenomenon that had not been fully characterized before. The nuée ardente, the rapidly moving cloud of superheated gas and volcanic material that can travel down a mountain's flank at hundreds of kilometers per hour, was described and named in the scientific literature produced by the investigators who studied Pelée after 1902. Alfred Lacroix, the French geologist who led the scientific investigation of the eruption in the months following May 8th, published a study that is considered one of the foundational documents of modern volcanology. His work at Pelée established the descriptive vocabulary and the observational framework for a category of volcanic hazard that the science had not formally defined before the mountain demonstrated it by killing 30,000 people. The knowledge that came from the catastrophe was knowledge that would have prevented it if it had existed before it occurred. What the inquiry was more reluctant to address directly was the electoral dimension. The official position was that the governor had acted on the best available scientific advice. The correspondence between Moutet's office and Fort-de-France in the weeks before the eruption, which shows awareness of the electoral stakes and of the political consequences of an evacuation order, was part of the documentary record, but not the primary focus of the inquiry's conclusions. The governor was dead. The election whose outcome he had been managing was rendered moot by the destruction of the island's primary population center. The political question that had shaped his calculations did not survive him in any form that required the inquiry to examine it too closely. The election scheduled for May 11th of 1902 did not take place on schedule. The destruction of Saint-Pierre and the subsequent months of continued volcanic activity made normal political life in the northern part of the island impossible through the summer and autumn of 1902. When the elections were eventually held later that year, the political geography of Martinique had been transformed by the deaths and displacements of a catastrophe that had killed not just the voters of Saint-Pierre, but the entire human and institutional fabric of the island's largest city. The candidate whose prospects the governor had been weighing against the danger of evacuation did not benefit from the outcome his calculations had helped produce. History does not record that he thought the trade was worth it, because the governor was not alive to record anything at all. The broader record of the period shows that the population of Saint-Pierre itself was not uniformly unaware of the danger. Several thousand people from the rural areas north of the city, in the zones closest to the mountain, had fled toward Saint-Pierre and further south in the days before the eruption, increasing the population of the city on the night of May 7th above its normal level. Some of the wealthier residents of Saint-Pierre had left for Fort-de-France on their own initiative. The population that remained in Saint-Pierre on the morning of May 8th was partly the population that had nowhere to go, partly the population that had trusted the official assurances, and partly the population that had arrived as refugees from further north, who had fled one danger and walked into the path of the larger one. The governor's reassuring statement in the official newspaper gave those who wanted to stay a reason to justify that decision, and it gave those who were uncertain a signal from authority that uncertainty was the correct register to apply to the situation. The statement did not tell 30,000 people that they were safe. It told them that there was no immediate danger. In the gap between those two statements was the difference between staying and leaving. And in the gap between staying and leaving was the difference between being in Saint-Pierre at 7:52 on May 8th and not being there. The case of Mount Pelée in 1902 sits at the intersection of three things that the historical record of disasters returns to repeatedly: the limits of scientific knowledge at the moment when that knowledge was most needed, the distortion of official decision-making by interests that were not the same as the interests of the population at risk, and the capacity of an official statement of reassurance to close a decision that private judgment might have kept open. None of these three things requires a conspiracy or a villain. The governor may have genuinely believed the scientific assessment he was citing. The scientists may have given the most honest assessment their knowledge allowed. The statement in the newspaper may have been written by someone who thought it was true. What it produced, in combination with the mountain's behavior at 7:52 on May 8th, was 30,000 dead. The cell that held Louis-Auguste Siparis was the only structure in the city that the flow could not kill its occupant through, and that was not because it had been designed as a refuge. It had been designed as a punishment. The geometry of its walls happened to provide what the geometry of the rest of the city did not: enough insulation from a temperature several hundred degrees above what the human body survives. Mount Pelée continued erupting after May 8th, with further pyroclastic activity through the summer and autumn of 1902. The city of Saint-Pierre was not rebuilt on its original site. The commercial capital of Martinique shifted to Fort-de-France permanently. The ruins of Saint-Pierre remained in the landscape of the island's northern coast, and in the decades following May 8th, they became, in their own way, a record of what the mountain had produced: the foundations of buildings, the remains of ships in the harbor, the fragments of the city's material life preserved under the ash that had covered them. The mountain that had overlooked the Paris of the Caribbean overlooked something quite different afterward.